Will anyone survive the night? As the sun hung low in the sky, the group of 5 friends waited at the gate of the tall chain-link fence with barbed wire coiled along the top. It was almost Halloween, and like every year, they chose a scary destination to visit. This year it was Solitude Penitentiary, an old prison with a dark, intense past. Drake, a journalist, always wrote about where they went each time, while Willow, a history buff, was intrigued by the events that unfolded during its lifetime. Trisha was only here for the thrill, while her boyfriend Chad loved urban exploring and the danger that came with it. Marcus was the odd one out, not believing or wanting to believe in the paranormal. He hated these trips, but always went anyway. Dressed in an old prison guard uniform, a man walked up to the gate slowly from the other side of the fence. He smiled at the group as he let them in. Locking the gate behind them, they felt chills run up their backs. "I'm Russell Turner," he said. "I'm your tour guide today of this historical facility." He led them through the corridor where all inmates were brought in, and when they were rarely paroled. Rain began to fall as the door closed loudly behind them, echoing through the room. "The history of Solitude Penitentiary is a gruesome one," he began as he led them into the processing area. "It received its name due to the fact that it was located in the middle of nowhere, and it was reinforced because most of the inmates were convicted of crimes so terrible that solitary confinement was a regular event for them. Riots and escape attempts plagued its short history. It closed in 1930 after a fire cost most of the prisoners their lives due to smoke inhalation. It only destroyed one small section that held the laundry and work area." "Fascinating," mumbled Willow, taking it all in. As they walked through the halls of the prison, they experienced cold chills and felt as if they were being watched. Drake took notes and tons of pictures along the way. He even went so far as to look around the cold areas to check for trickery, but never found any. When they reached the common eating area, each drifted away a little to check it out. Marcus stayed near Russell, though, taking pictures. Suddenly, Trisha cried out, startled. Chad reached her first. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, "but I felt something brush past me. Sorry, it just surprised me." "Is it just me, or are the shadows moving?" asked Chad. "I noticed it too," Willow nodded. As they all regrouped, Marcus looked over the recent photos and noticed something odd. "Hey guys," he frowned. "Some of the pictures have spots on them." Trisha came closer with Chad to check out the camera. "Those are orbs," she corrected. "This is out of this world. Best destination yet." "I'm reserving my opinion until we leave," Marcus frowned. "Me too," Drake agreed. Willow nodded in agreement as well. "For the next stop on our tour, the infirmary," Russell told them. "Goody," said Marcus sarcastically. "Disgusting stuff time." To the group's surprise, the hospital wing was clean overall, with the exception of the layers of dust that had piled up over the years. Instruments were still laid out, ready to be used. Cobwebs were everywhere. White linen was tinged yellow with age. Windows let in a little light through its dirty panes of glass. Unfortunately, many inmates died here due to injuries sustained during fights and riots, Russell told them. Being a prison, they weren't able to hire the upper level of doctor that they truly needed. Chad and Trisha jumped back from the group, surprise mixed with fear etched on their faces, and pointing toward the door. By the time everyone turned to look, nothing was there. "There were 2 people in gray jumpsuits in the doorway," Chad said. "Then they just faded away," Trisha whispered. "I've never seen anything like that before." "I'm getting goosebumps," Willow admitted. "This isn't dangerous, is it?" Concern flickered briefly across her face. "These were inmates at one of the highest security prisons of the time," said Russell. "Nothing's happened to anyone yet, but that is why you have to sign the waiver to take the tour." "Here's to hoping we aren't the first," said Chad, taking a sip of water from his water bottle. "I second that," added Marcus, crossing his fingers. As Russell led them to the inmate quarters and solitary confinement cells, Drake noticed Russell beginning to act nervous and checking his watch every few minutes. Looking at Willow, Drake noticed she saw it too. After reaching the cells, Russell caught Drake noticing and shrugged. "We're entering the evening part of the tour," he told them. "I've never been here this late before." "You haven't?" asked Willow. "This is my first evening tour," he admitted hesitantly as they walked. "I've been working here for several months, and I've been told that the paranormal activity has increased from once or twice a month to almost daily now." "Do you know why?" asked Trisha as she rubbed her neck. "No," he said. "It's weird though. Maybe Maybe they like me. This place is definitely creepier when the sun goes down, admitted Willow as they entered a hallway with standard cells along each side of the corridor. As they passed, everyone was quiet. Each cell was tiny, barely big enough for a set of bunk beds and facilities on the corner. Even though I know the criminals committed atrocious acts to get sentenced here, I hate to think of anyone having to live in these conditions, Willow mumbled, thinking aloud. Trisha gave her a curious look. From the stories I've heard of this facility when it was up and running, Russell told them, the people that were sent here were the worst of the worst at the time. I think their souls hang on to this place because they're afraid of whatever awaits them in the hereafter. There is another possible reason, Trisha said in a low voice. Really? Russell asked. I'm just glad they're helping business here. That's kind of a callous outlook, don't you think? Asked Drake. So what's the other possibility? Asked Chad, watching Trisha intently. Revenge. Plain and simple, she clipped, sounding angry. Spirits love to get even for wrongs done to them during life. What wrongs? Russell frowned. The inmates were the ones doing horrible things. Chad watched as a muscle ticked across Trisha's jaw. Her expression changed to a look of pure hatred, and he frowned, starting to worry about her. They were people, she hissed. The riots. Their behavior. It all stemmed from how they were treated. They were tortured and experimented on. Russell turned pale. I'm not sure where you heard that lie, he said, slightly nervous. Guess people make up all kinds of things to vilify prisons. The warden during the worst riot was evil in person form, Trisha said, her voice dropping to an unnaturally low pitch. I see the connection clearly now. Her eyes became fully black as she stared Russell down. Everyone except Chad backed up immediately. You're insane, Russell whispered. Wrong affliction, she smirked. She's just temporarily helping me out. Let me introduce myself. I'm inmate number 579, Walter Bennett. You should not even know that name, Russell whispered. Neither should you unless you heard it from your great-grandfather, the warden, Walter said through Trisha. Willow gasped. Chad moved in to restrain Trisha as she rolled her eyes. Once he was close enough, she backhanded him with enough power to hit the wall and knock him out cold. Everyone froze in place, unfortunately giving her the opportunity to grab Russell by the neck and disappear down the hall with him. What are we gonna do? Asked Willow as Drake bent down to see how Chad was. It appeared he'd had the wind knocked out of him, but he should be okay. Drake figured he'd be unconscious for quite a while. I can stay with them, Marcus offered. I can try to get him back to the entrance and call for help. We'll head after Trisha, or Walter, I mean, Drake said. I took a look at the map before we came in, Willow said. Photographic memory. Love it, Drake smiled. Let's go. They weren't sure how long it took, but it was easy enough to follow the scuff marks in the dust and dirt. Eventually, they led to a large room at the end of a hall. They heard Trisha's altered deep voice mumbling, but were unable to hear until they drew closer. You are just as vile as the warden, Walter said through her. Tell me what I want to know. Shaking his head, he'd reached his breaking point. She held something tightly in her fist. Russell stared at her hand, tears streaming down his face, shaking his head. He had reached his breaking point. Okay, he cried. My family bought this place, and I wanted to use it to exploit any spirits here to make money. I figured it didn't matter since you were dead already anyway. That's an excellent suggestion, her voice said menacingly. No, cried out Drake and Willow at the same time as they rushed into the room, hearing what was said. Help me, wailed Russell. Shut up, Drake frowned at him. You and your family are why we're all in this mess right now. Willow nodded but kept her eyes on Trisha. Please don't make Trisha do this, she begged Walter. What if she sees everything you're doing? A thoughtful look flashed across his face. I don't wish that on this sensitive woman, came the response. Without a word, Trisha's arms went up into the air and she closed her eyes. Her mouth was moving, but they didn't hear her voice. Seconds later, shadows seeped into the room. They began to swirl around the edges near the walls. In this room, where the warden took so many of our lives, it seems only fitting to add one last one, Walter said, using Trisha's guttural voice. As the shadows circled the room, their paths tightened into what looked like a living, or rather unliving, tornado that knew exactly what it was doing. Russell's terror-filled cries turned into screams as the shadows began phasing through his arms and feet. Please hear me out, Drake said, stepping toward Trisha. He and his family don't deserve mercy, but if you let go of this revenge, maybe you could move on to a peaceful place. Trisha's face turned into a look of utter disbelief. You are really more naive than you look, came the guttural reply. None of us were good people. We willingly made our bad choices. There is no peace for us after this. When we pass on, we will rot in torment for all time. You have a good heart, but don't bother worrying about us." With the last of his speech done, a darker shadow than the others pulled out from Trisha. Drake and Willow caught her before she fell to the ground. They watched as Walter's spirit made a beeline straight for Russell's chest. He passed through slowly, exactly where the heart is located. By the time his spirit was emerging from the other side, he was dragging out a shadow from the now quiet and still Russell. After the new shadow was completely removed, Walter tossed it to the remaining spirits, and they latched onto it and disappeared with it into the wall. Drake, Willow, and Trisha all sat on the ground with horrified expressions. Walter's spirit hovered in front of them for a moment. It bowed its head, and they briefly heard the word goodbye before it followed the others into the wall. Trisha dropped her head, a tear spilling down her cheek before she reined in her emotions. "While he was with me," Trisha explained, her voice back to its normal sweet quality, "I felt all he'd been through. It was heartbreaking. Let's go find Marcus and Chad," Willow suggested. "Oh no, Chad!" Trisha exclaimed. "I hope he's all right." They quickly made their way back to where the two had been, but the area was empty. From the look of the scuff marks on the floor, Marcus did as he'd said. They followed the marks, and Willow affirmed that they were heading toward the exit. Prepared for the darkness since it was late, they were totally caught off guard when they went outside. It was as bright as day thanks to the prison floodlights to catch escaped inmates. Marcus was with Chad at an ambulance nearby. Police approached immediately in a flurry of questions and identification checks. Knowing that ghosts and possession would only be met with laughter and ultimately disbelief, they'd agreed to the most basic version of the truth. Russell collapsed, and they didn't know how to explain what happened. Their statements were varied enough to not seem as rehearsed. When they were released, they immediately went to see their friends. "Are you all right?" asked Trisha, holding Chad's hand. "I'm so sorry this happened. I'll fill you in later." Her gaze went to the paramedic. "He seems okay," one paramedic told them. "We'll be taking him in a few minutes to the hospital for observation and other tests. I'll be back shortly." He walked off toward the officers at the command post. "How did all this come about?" asked Drake, confused. "When we got topside, I called 911, Marcus told him. "At first, it was one ambulance and one dispatched officer. Paramedics immediately went to Chad, and the police officer talked to me. Afterward, he ran the plates on the cars here. Apparently, he found some blood at the trunk of Russell's car. They just found his plans in his car to off in the lower level of the end of the tour. They were on their way in when you guys showed up. I'm glad you all made it." "So are we," whispered Willow. "Next year, I vote we go to the haunted house ride at an amusement park." "I second that," Chad said, holding his side, trying not to laugh. "All in favor?" asked Drake. All 5 of them raised their hands. Unanimously passed. Like and subscribe for more scary stories like this. Check out this one next.